With that, I'd like to introduce Mr. De Gucht. Many of you probably have already read his bio. He's a former foreign minister, deputy prime minister of Belgium. He went to the European Commission in 2009 with the aid and development portfolio. He has held his current role on trade since February 2002 for the past 2 years. He's just arrived here from Beijing. Please, everybody, let's welcome him. Thank you.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for this very warm welcome in a somewhat chilly place. But when a European spends time in Asia and compares its economic vitality with the news coming from home, he may be tempted at times to feel a little envious. Standing here in this venerable institution, at the heart of this dazzling city, it might also be tempting to feel a little nostalgia for a time when this part of the Asian economic miracle was, in some aspects, also part of Europe. But such sentiments would very definitely be misplaced. The economic progress we all seek in Europe and Asia cannot be based on looking to the past. Today's economic challenges require adaptation and innovation. As Chris Patton noted on leaving this city in '97, sometimes we should remember the past, the better to forget it. At the same time, any caricature of the economic present that depicts a steadily declining Europe and a uniformly prosperous Asia would be, at best, highly incomplete. Europe's present is challenging, certainly. Parts of our Union are facing painful adjustments to a new economic reality. But Europe as a whole remains strong in many respects, not least in our continuing competitiveness in matters of international trade and investment. By contrast, although Asia's success continues to elicit admiration, slow growth in the US and in Europe is affecting export-driven economies as well. Emerging markets now find that each new step on the way to greater prosperity is more difficult than the last one. What I feel standing here in Hong Kong is a sense of possibility. As Europeans and Asians move now to revamp our economies in the face of deep global transformations, we have an opportunity to do so in cooperation. We must not jeopardize the open markets that have proven so valuable for our economies over the past decades. We must instead continue to fight protectionism and make the case for free trade. China has a particularly important role to play in this process, given its huge influence on and stake in the system. We can also use this moment of change to strengthen our relationships between the EU and China, but also between the EU and the wider region. Our partnership will only be reinforced, however, if, as well as celebrating our achievements, we also seek to overcome our differences through frank discussion. Finally, the economic situation in Europe also represents a possibility. In finding a way through, we will have to deal with many structural weaknesses that we have waited for too long to address. Though the European economy has its difficulties, the reports of our debt are greatly exaggerated. Ladies and gentlemen, it's of course standard practice for a European Trade Commissioner to speak up against protectionism. I will not do so just because it's part of my job description, however, but because at this moment in time, after 2 years in the job and 3 years into the crisis, I am concerned that the risk of a return to protectionism remains undiluted. If all things considered, protectionism remained rather limited in the immediate aftermath of the economic crisis, affecting only about 1% of world trade, it has proven to be more persistent than was expected and seems to be further on the rise. Instead of being dismantled, as the G20 countries have promised, the number of protectionist measures put in place since the crisis has increased. 425 of the potentially trade restrictive measures that were installed since the onset of the crisis remain in force, whereas only 71 have been removed to date. Over the last 12 months, a total of 131 new measures were introduced. The G20 commitments to reduce them have not been sufficient. Instead, a new generation of protectionist measures is in gestation. The new industrial policies of several G20 members raise concerns about open trade and investment. They are, in many cases, based on import substitution, subsidies, domestic preference, local content requirements, restrictions in public procurement, and pressure to transfer intellectual property. We know the reasons for this. Slow growth translates into higher unemployment and persistent public deficits. These create anxiety and put to the test people's faith in the market economy and globalization, as well in their government's ability to do much about their problems. 20 years ago, some predicted the end of history, as people in all parts of the world appeared to be embracing the liberal world order. Today, many are resentful of the excesses in markets, financial markets in particular, and doubtful of their gains for international trade and investment. State capitalism is enjoying increasing popularity. Under such circumstances, the basic tenets of economic policy will always be put into question. And that includes the belief in free trade that has contributed so much to growth across the world over recent decades. Now, I do not need to labor this point here in Hong Kong or in mainland China, since the best examples of trade-led growth are in this part of the globe. But allow me to say it nonetheless. It is vital that trade policymakers continue to make the case for openness, particularly in the face of pressures from our citizens, whose concern about free trade may be well motivated if misdirected. Paradoxically, it's only by embracing open markets that we will be able to alleviate their anxiety, by putting our economies on a path to renewed growth and development. A prime source of people's anxiety is, of course, China, often the elephant in the room. That is not just the case for Europeans or Americans. From Brazil to Mexico and Turkey to Korea, people are increasingly in two minds about cooperation and competition with China, a partner whose economic emergence has stupefied citizens and businessmen since it joined the WTO 10 years ago. More and more people are asking whether the international economic and legal framework is still valid under the circumstances, especially since updating it has become much more difficult in a world of divergent interests that still requires consensus. I do not underestimate these difficulties, but I do believe that instead of moving away from rules-based trade, we need to redouble our efforts to reinforce the framework and ensure that the current rules are fully respected. No country more than China has benefited more from the current framework, whether in terms of share of exports or the benefits from trade in its domestic economy. But as it gains prominence and in some areas even achieves dominance, China needs to adapt to its new position of strength and leadership. It must help ease anxieties about open markets among its partners by applying and underwriting the rules, even if this means changing long-held government practices. For the economic challenges China will face in the decades to come can only be met in a context of global trade and in cooperation with governments and businesses worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, we know, of course, that the move towards genuine free market economics is not and never will be an easy ride. The transformation of China's economy and society has already been enormous. The next phase of economic development will prove to be equally, if not more, difficult. Free markets are never as harmonious as we would like them to be, and it is easy to see how that can be a deeply unsettling thought for a country with China's outlook, past, and priorities. We in the West and in other parts of the world must not underestimate the challenges the Chinese system faces. We must not underrate the gigantic changes that have already been taken place either. And we must not undermine the commitment of the Chinese people to open markets. They believe that trade will be one of the main drivers of prosperity in the future, as it has been in the past. These imperatives are fundamentally entwined. If China were to feel consistently marginalized by the rest of the world, misunderstood and mistreated, its enthusiasm for open markets could easily cool. It might try to seek a new deal with its citizens that would no longer rely on international markets, firms and partners. And we would all be much the worse off as a result. I will not be part of any such marginalization. There are some who say we are already in a trade war with China. I believe that they are wrong in their analysis of the present and downright reckless in light of the way our partnership with China should evolve in the future. I will continue to do my utmost to make the relationship with China work, for I know how important and beneficial a strategic partnership is for both Europe and China. Just 2 decades ago, China and the EU traded almost nothing. Today we form the second largest economic partnership in the world. In a remarkably short time frame, our economies have integrated to a point where it is difficult to imagine one without the other. Our bilateral trade in goods reached 395 billion in 2010, and in 2011, 428.3 billion. Europe exports to China rose by slightly more than a third, to 130 billion in 2010, and even more in 2011. These figures represented all-time highs, and again, I believe that this year we will set new records. By November 2011, Chinese imports to the EU were up a further 5%, and EU exports to China up by 21%. And that trend continued till the end of last year. Our task for the coming years is to expand and deepen this progress into a broad, long-term partnership. One area of untapped potential is investment. Europe still invests less in China than in Norway, and China's investments in the EU amount, surprisingly, to less than 1 billion last year. The EU is therefore assessing whether it may be viable to open more formal discussions on investment issues. I also believe that as the EU and China become ever more dependent on innovation for growth, there is much we can do together to enhance the innovative capacities of our economies. There is a considerable scope for discussions in the framework of an innovation dialogue. Ladies and gentlemen, our flourishing trade relationship is an achievement to be celebrated. But as partners, we also need to have clear-sighted discussions about our differences in order to surmount them. As I offer awareness, insight and respect to my Chinese counterparts, I expect nothing less in return. As we understand the strains of liberalization among the Chinese people, so too must China grasp that European support for open markets can only be guaranteed if accepted by the public at large. And that acceptance requires a perception of fairness. Regardless of the economic fruits of increasing trade, there is a general feeling among European companies and governments that economic openness in China is improving too slowly or not at all. Let me quote two issues that raise a lot of eyebrows in Europe. The first is raw materials. Last month, the WTO appellate body confirmed a panel ruling against China's use of export restrictions of certain raw materials, backing a case jointly brought by the US, Mexico, and the European Union. WTO found China's restrictive export regime in breach of its international commitments. It could not be justified on the basis of the environmental concerns cited, because these cannot be addressed simply by discriminating against foreign competition. The decision is significant. For the first time, the appellate body has clarified the disciplines on export restrictions for the entire WTO membership. This is a recognition of the increasing relevance of the raw materials business, which currently amounts to 25% of total world trade. We expect China to revisit its overall export restriction regime in the light of this clarification. The ruling is a verdict for open trade and fair access to raw materials. It has major implications for the much discussed rare earths that are so essential for global high-tech industries. And I sincerely hope that China will uphold its good records on the implementation of WTO reports and bring its rules unequivocally into compliance with the WTO commitments. The second issue that is hotly debated is in the EU is public procurement. Small wonder, purchases by governments represent 17% of the world economy, and companies whose business depends on procurement represent 25% of EU GDP and 31 million jobs. And yet, in many countries, this market is only partially open to foreign competition. To give just one example, only 5% of public procurement concerning metro networks in the EU's top 12 trading partners is legally open to competition under international agreements. Not so in the European Union, which has one of the most open procurement markets in the world. The EU has made more commitments to grant foreign access to its procurement markets than any other member of the WTO government. Whereas the value of EU public procurement open to bidders from outside the EU reaches 352 billion. The estimated value of US procurement offered to foreign bidders is just 178 billion, and that figure is 27 for Japan. This openness has meant huge business opportunities for non-EU firms, including companies from China, in such key sectors such as rail and construction. Now, while some in Europe might question this access, let me be clear. I strongly believe in an open procurement policy as it delivers the best value for our taxpayers' money. But what I find much harder to explain are the barriers EU exporters face when they try to compete on procurement markets abroad. China is certainly not the only country where there are problems, but problems there definitely are. A recent study by the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China estimated that Chinese public procurement markets to be as large as 7,000 billion renminbi, or 830 billion euros, of which only a small fraction is open to foreign business. The study found problems with access to information on tenders, unfair implementation and insufficient appeal mechanisms. It also noted that in infrastructure, a key part of the procurement market, new projects are frequently carried out through state-owned enterprises and therefore, by definition, not open to competition. It is in response to this type of imbalance that I am finalizing together with my colleague in charge of the internal market, Michel Barnier, a proposal for a new instrument to encourage open markets for procurements around the world. We believe that the most effective route to liberalization, here as in all areas of trade, is through negotiations. But negotiations only work, though, when both sides see something to be gained. And the challenge for our negotiators is what to offer when the EU market is already open. What is needed is an incentive for cooperation, an incentive for opening on the part of our partners. The aim of the new tool is to provide just such an incentive, by raising the possibility that current access might be lost if cooperation is not forthcoming. But rest assured, those to whom the EU has made legal commitments have nothing to be concerned about. As ever, the EU will fully respect its international obligations. It will only be if our partners refuse to agree to a fair solution that the EU would resort to blocking or complicating access. But it is crucial for the system and for our goal of open markets that the Commission has the authority to close access to a sector for third country operators wherever they come from, if this is what is required. The door of free trade has to be open both ways. Otherwise, public demands to shut it all together will continue to gather strength. This is decidedly not what I'm working towards, so I hope we will find mutually agreed and beneficial ways to move forward. Ladies and gentlemen, with so much public attention focused on China, you could almost forget that Asia is larger than China alone. The European Union has not made this mistake. Our trade strategy aims to strengthen our partnerships with countries in the region that harness a remarkable amount of economic potential. We are ambitious in pursuing that policy, and in turn these countries have recognized the potential of the European economy in fulfilling their own ambitions. So much is happening within this region and among emerging markets worldwide. Intra-emerging markets trade, which rose from only 5% of world trade in 2000 to 15% in 2010, is set to account for 27% of world trade in 2030 and 38% in 2050. Europe, rather than seeing this as a threat, wants to use trade agreements and relations with these countries as a way to tap into these sources of growth. We do not intend just to watch from the sidelines. Our free trade agreement with South Korea was the first in a series of far-reaching FTAs we want to conclude. Negotiations with Singapore are progressing, and we hope to conclude by the summer of this year. Next on the list is Malaysia. Outside the ASEAN region, we are already negotiating with India and are exploring possible negotiations with Japan. Of course, the best help to our trade with Asia, we remain convinced, would be a strong conclusion of the Doha round. This city, Hong Kong, plays a key role in our strategy towards both China and the rest of Asia. It remains a strategic platform for EU companies trading and investing both in China and in other neighboring countries. Already it is the largest foreign investor in China, contributing to around 25% to 38% of the total realized FDI from 2000 to 2008. Also, Hong Kong is increasingly becoming the conduit for mainland Chinese companies going out and expanding international financial center and the regional trading hub. The rule of law in Hong Kong and the top quality financial and related services are key to all of this. This is an environment in which European companies feel at home, or at least comfortably at work. They already play a major role in the day-to-day business of Hong Kong, for instance in finance, shipping, logistics, and we expect that they will continue to have this opportunity, without regard to their nationality and on an equal footing with their local our mainland Chinese competitors. Ladies and gentlemen, at first glance, Asia's rise and vitality do contrast sharply with Europe's current predicament. Not surprisingly, many people conclude that Europe is a spent force. And it's not only people in emerging economies who think so. A transatlantic trends poll showed that last year, for the first time, a slight majority of Americans feel that Asian countries were more important to their country's national interests than they were countries of the EU. At the same time, a Pew Global Attitudes survey pointed out that 63% of Chinese, 65% of Britons, and even 46% of Americans believe China will soon be the world's leading superpower. Indeed, many think it has already taken over from the US in that respect. If that is your frame of mind, there seems little room for the EU to play a strong, positive role. There is an element of schadenfreude in all this. Having been on the receiving end for years of often unwanted advice, often linked to economic aid, some people in developing countries are not upset to see Europe and the West, more generally, eating a bit of humble pie. And on a personal level, who can blame them? But this would be a premature assessment, and a politically unproductive one at that. In terms of economic governance, Europe will exit the current crisis stronger than before. And in terms of economic weight, we will continue to play a major role. It would be foolish to understate the trouble we are currently in, but we should beware of simplistic conclusions about Europe's economic model and importance. To be sure, parts of the Eurozone, particularly the south of Europe, are going through a tough time. A painful adjustment process is working off the excesses that built up in the years before 2007, fueled by cheap credits and capital imports and wages that outpaced productivity growth. The shock of the financial crisis has raised the spectre of a messy default that would create huge panic in global financial markets. These problems are very serious. We are, however, making good progress through enhanced budget discipline and the erection of financial firewalls to prevent catastrophe. But I feel I must point out that even today we are more than just on the right track. Despite initial appearances, the European Union as a whole, and for that matter the Euro, are in pretty good health. The EU remains the biggest exporter. The EU has a 207 billion trade surplus in manufactures. The overall image is somewhat distorted because this surplus is offset by an even larger deficit in oil, gas and minerals. But what can we do about that? You can only dig out of the soil what is in the soil, of course. The EU's share of world exports remained broadly stable over the decades. Over the same period, the US share fell from 17.4% to 11.8%, and Japan's from 10.7% to 6.5%. The EU maintains its global leadership in high value-added products, 30% as opposed to 13.5% for the US and 9.8% for Japan, and high-tech, 60.9% in 2007 compared with the US 30.5% and Japan 8%. More fundamentally, it is just plain wrong to say that Europe as a whole has a problem of competitiveness or that we live beyond our means. Just look at our current account, which is by small amount in surplus. The euro remains and will stay the second reserve currency in the world. In Germany and countries in North and Eastern Europe, the feeling of economic crisis is very limited. I do not pretend to downplay the frictions in the functioning of the monetary union. They are real and pervasive. But in terms of the fundamentals, the European economy still exhibits considerable strengths. And as is often the case, the cloud of the crisis also has a silver lining. The crisis is giving governments the possibility finally to grasp the nettle and carry out many unpleasant structural reforms, reforms that are vital to boost our potential outputs in areas like pensions, labor markets, regulated professions, services and education. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we are living through times of very rapid change, times of profound transformation. History is quickening its step, causing pain but also offering great opportunities. The world economy is in a process of rebalancing, and this will go on for a while. But let's not fear the future. Mr. Yogi Berra, the former American Major League Baseball player, is renowned for his weird but wonderful sayings. He has pertinent advice for those in doubt about what the future has in store. And I quote, "When you come to a fork in the road, take it." Thank you very much.
Do you want to stay? Let's go. Yeah. Thank you very much for that very interesting speech, Mr. De Gucht. And with that, I'd like to throw open the floor for questions. And if you could each please identify yourselves at the start of each question. Why don't we start here in the middle, please?
Thank you very much for sharing insights into what's happening in the EU. Particularly valuable because oftentimes what you hear on the news paints a much gloomier picture and doesn't show the potential. You had mentioned free trade agreements that were under negotiation. Do you have any timeline for when they might be implemented? You had mentioned Malaysia and India and Japan.
Can you please all identify yourselves as well when you're answering questions?
I'm Jane Singer from Inside Fashion.
It's always very dangerous to make predictions on that because negotiations sometimes make very rapid progress and then get stalled for some time. No? But as I said in my speech, we hope that we can end the negotiations with Singapore before the summertime. But take India. Yeah, yes, we can have a deal, I believe, by September, provided that the political resolve stays with us. No? Because we still have a number of problems to tackle, and it's quite different whether you negotiate, for example, on goods or on services, because for services, India has to change its legislation, and for a government it's not easy to engage a parliament. So I'm cautious, but I think we are making steady progress. On Japan, we have always held the line that we are ready to engage in negotiations with them, provided that they make a serious, though initial step on making away with non-tariff barriers. And they are making progress, but they should make more progress. So a negotiating path with Japan starts from that point, that they clearly demonstrate that they are in a position, that they are ready, willing, whatever word you might use, to make away with a number of major impediments.
European journalist Ernst, please, out on the veranda there, please.
Ernst Herp, I'm Swiss, so not from the European Union. Nevertheless, allow me to ask.
So European, not European Union. I was careful on that.
Finanz und Wirtschaft, business newspaper from Switzerland. Question: the Euro crisis has
Can you not come a little bit closer and put your question?
Okay, the Euro crisis has brought kind of new dynamic into the European Union and the Chinese relationships, particularly when it comes to demand from China that the European Union would lift its arms embargo towards China. When you travel right now to Beijing, is that you feel a new assertiveness on the side from Beijing to bring this point across? That's maybe the first question. The second question is, China has shown its preference when it came to the point to helping solving the euro crisis, that they rather prefer to buy physical assets, companies in Europe, in these troubled countries, instead of buying debt. Can you understand that type of preference? Can you understand the preference that Beijing prefers to buy physical assets in Europe instead of buying troubled debt?
May I propose, Chairman, I think I more or less got the questions, but that if somebody puts a question that he comes to the forefront, because it's a danger in itself to respond to a question that you hardly have understood.
It's okay.
But I think I grasped them more or less. No, not a word was said about the arms embargo during the summit. Not a word. By the way, this is, from the European point of view, a very complicated thing. The arms embargo has been decided unanimously. All member states agreed on that. And that's also why there is an arms embargo, because it's part of the common foreign and security policy, and you can only take decisions by unanimity. But it also means that you would need unanimity to make away with the arms embargo. So that's I think a technical and a political problem that remains. But it was not discussed, I mean, in no way. I can understand that the Chinese are interested in buying physical assets, just as the Americans are interested in buying physical assets in Europe, and we are interested in buying physical assets in the US and in China. But I think it's a completely different thing. It doesn't have, there's no relation. I mean, this is not something as of an alternative. I mean, this is it's doing business, and the financial crisis, and because you are, I think, making the comparison with that, it's a completely different topic. It's about crisis in sovereign debt. I cannot see what buying physical assets in Europe would add to resolving the sovereign debt crisis. I mean, nothing. What I understand is that they are interested in technology, but what they should realize is that this should go along with an excellent protective system of intellectual property rights. That's what it is really about. All the time companies get bought and sold, but it's what are you going to do afterwards with it? And that's respecting the integrity of the business that you are buying, and also respecting the intellectual property. That's what it is really about. And there should also be reciprocity. I have no problems that Chinese companies are buying assets in Europe, but we should also have the possibility to do the same in the Chinese market. And when you look at the investment catalog, yes, they added a couple of sectors, but they also scrapped a couple of sectors. So it has remained the same. And you are optimistic when you say that, you know, that it has remained the same. So no problem about all this, but then reciprocity and openness should be the rule on both sides.
South China Morning Post. We're running over here, but we'll try to take a vote.
I'm To Han Chi, a reporter from the South China Morning Post. When do you think the European Union might grant China market economy status? And do you see the EU doing some kind of deal with China where, you know, China will help resolve EU's sovereign debt crisis, and in return EU will lessen anti-dumping measures or open up EU markets more to China?
The question everybody here was wondering about.
when you look at the press communique at the end of the summit, there is positive language on market economy status. I think more positive than ever before. But there is also clear language on export credit, also clearer than ever before. And although I see no formal linking, well, they are part of the same problem. Because in the market economy that is properly functioning, you should not have heavily subsidized exports. So we should not look at it just from one side. And secondly, we are not going to link anything like that. You know, I mean, it's whether the Chinese make investments in European bonds or in the FSF or in the ESM or indirectly through the IMF, we are not going to change our policy with respect to trade defense instruments. How it really works is that you get a complaint by a company, and if they can with proof that there are serious problems, we investigate them, and if we come to the same conclusion, we go for it. And that will not change in kind of a deal, you know. I mean, I don't believe in that kind of deals, and I'm not going to make them. They haven't asked for that either, by the way, but this is the natural tendency, of course, of journalists to put that kind of questions. But no links. I mean, we have our policy, and we are going to continue performing it.
We do have time, I gather, for another question here, please.
Thank you. I'm Denise with the South China Post also. Well, I've got two questions. How does Wen Jiabao's pledge to help the EU reshape the debt crisis situation? And the second question is...
What is the first question?
Well, how does the mainland's pledge in helping the European debt crisis reshape the situation? And the second thing is...
how will Wen Jiabao make comments about China wanting to be helpful? Do you think that's actually going to make any difference on the European debt crisis in the foreseeable future, say? And why don't we leave it one question per person?
And then in the past 2 days, you met with some mainland officials. So what's the message you got from the meeting, especially on the market opening? Thank you.
Yes, I believe it makes a difference, and not only for China. I mean, it would also make a difference for other emerging economies if they were participating in this burden, because European economy is that big that the rest of the world cannot be prosperous if the European economy is going in the wrong direction. And so we are very much interdependent in this respect, and so it's not that much an investment in a European quote unquote problem, but an investment in their own future. Now, apart from that, what the message was on market access, there I believe we made considerable progress, because for the first time ever they have agreed that if investment negotiations were to come about, they would not only be about the traditional concept of investment protection, but that these negotiations should also address national treatment, which means that your own companies get treated in the same way that Chinese companies get treated in China, but also about market access. Which sectors are we allowed to invest in? And that's, I think, an important step forward. Now we will have to see when and whether the negotiations start. But they went away from the traditional concept of limiting investment negotiations to investment protection. That's what they are interested in, of course, and I mean the link to the physical assets that the gentleman was mentioning. But they will also have to grant market access and national treatment. If not, there will not be a deal.
Toby here, please. And then the last one will be out on the veranda. We're running a little over, but Mr. De Gucht has the time.
Very quickly, the EU has maintained a very effective arms embargo, but has not maintained an effective dual-use technology transfer program. And if you look at recent advances in Chinese submarine technology, the avionics that they're using in their aircraft, some of the technology that's going into their offensive missiles, all of that can be traced to a very adroit playing off of the United States and the EU with regard to large procurement programs that China has engaged in. And those procurement programs have had very significant technology transfer elements to them. So what I would like is your reaction to one, the arms embargo, and two, the porous nature of technology transfer from Europe.
As I tried to explain in answering a previous question, the arms embargo is a political problem, also inside Europe, apart from the substance. Because it has been decided unanimously, you can only change it unanimously. It's a fact of life. And what it really means is that even if at a certain moment in time it would become rather hollow, it would not necessarily mean that it goes away, because you need unanimity, and not all 27 member states are thinking the same about this. Huh? But I agree with you that the indirect transfer of technology that can be used in weapon systems probably is much more of a concern than the actual arms embargo. And you're right that in the framework of important deals, deliveries of important, how would I call this? It's not only about planes, of course, but state-of-the-art machinery and processes and software and so on, that a lot of technology gets transferred at the level of the companies, because that's part of the business deal. It's up to the countries concerned to see how far they can go in that respect. But it's certainly so that in major deals, technology is transferred. That in itself is not so uncommon. It happens all over the place. Whether this is a serious security concern or not, that's not particularly up to a trade commissioner to have a final judgment upon that, but I agree with you that yes, there is considerable transfer of technology, and then you can argue to what extent it is free or forced, because that depends on what your judgment is on the deal, of course.
Last question. I believe we had one out on the veranda. If we have time for just one more, yes. Maybe if you can come forward so that our speaker can...
Sorry, I'll try to be quick, and thank you very much for giving me this last question. First of all, I'd like to thank the Commissioner for a very comprehensive overview. Now, my question is straight to the, on the point of investments from China. We've talked about hard assets, but there are two things which China would be extremely interested, and that is the infrastructural links between China, the whole country, in fact, with Europe by high-speed rail. In fact, China is working on the project, as you probably know, and a number of European countries are working on that as well. So my question is that, sort of what's your approach to that issue? The other one, of course, is the internationalization of the renminbi. Apart from London, would there be any other European financial centers which would be interested in helping China to internationalize the renminbi? And of course, China wants a very strong euro as a counterweight against the US dollar. But then likewise, the renminbi needs to be internationalized without, of course, immediate convertibility. But then internationalization using renminbi as a means for trade settlement and so on. So two issues.
infrastructure, high-speed rail, and the renminbi internationalization? Thank you.
What, please?
I think his first question is whether Europe is interested in having someday high-speed rail connections to China, which would be across Russia, I guess. And the second question, and it might be more in the area of your colleague on financial services, is where you see renminbi trading taking place in Europe someday.
Whether Europe is interested in having a connection by railway with China, I really couldn't give you a clear answer on that. I think that when you look at the distances, that's not for tomorrow. No? But you could have an interconnectivity of high-speed rail between countries. By the way, it should not necessarily go by Russia, but rather by Central Asia, I think. No, when I look at the map, but I don't know. I mean, there can be plans in that respect, but I don't see the immediate, how would I say, advantage of doing it, because transport by container is so cheap in the end that I don't think there is a profitable alternative to that at this moment in time. I'm not an expert in transport, but that's what I would think. You know? And also you should also consider that the geographic situation is not very good to start such an effort. For example, building a pipeline between Turkmenistan and China, passing by India, it's a tremendous work, and I don't know where they yet are, but I mean it's huge, the infrastructural effort you have to make there. So I don't know. And the second one was on.
Do you see places other than London having RMB trading?
What you see is that Hong Kong is developing as the main renminbi hub, offshore renminbi hub, and I think that's going to continue like that. You have now, if I understand it rightly, you have made an arrangement with London by which your opening hours are 5 hours longer. But you will see developing a renminbi market much further, I believe, in Hong Kong. And they have already trade settlements in renminbi with other emerging countries, like, for example, with Brazil. You also see that European companies are issuing bonds in renminbi here in Hong Kong to finance their operations in China. So all this makes sense, and it's probably going to develop further, but I don't think it tells us much about the convertibility of the renminbi. That's, I think, a completely different game. I cannot see that they could get to a convertible currency without drastically reforming their banking system. So these are, I believe, two parallel evolutions that do not necessarily get across anytime soon.
One last quick question then as we wrap up, because we have to go now, and that's just quickly, since it didn't come up at all here though. Iran said overnight it may cut off oil supplies to 6 European countries, essentially threatening to cut them off now rather than waiting for the EU sanctions to kick in as of, I believe, June 30th. Given that trade is part of your portfolio, does that concern you that they turn into a threat, or is it in fact the whole idea of the sanctions is that at some point the oil supplies might be cut off by Iran to Europe?
The reason that the oil embargo with Iran starts, is it not the 1st of June, isn't it?
Oh, 1st of June, June 30th.
End of June or 1st of June, I don't know.
1st of June. 1st of July.
Is of course because member states have to accommodate their supplies. But if they were to cut it off earlier, we would accommodate quicker.
Okay.
That's what we will do. On the other hand, I don't believe they will do so. I don't think they will cut it off unless they would have other outlays for their production. And there we hope that, well, we understand that certain countries continue their trade in oil with Iran because they are a major supplier, but we hope that they would not, how would I say, replace the European demand. No? That we would look upon as something which is particularly unproductive for the resolving of a problem, by the way, that is common to the whole world. I believe that there is nobody who really wants Iran to have nuclear weapons, just as we don't want North Korea to have them. And I believe that this, I don't not only believe it, they also say that the Chinese do not want that either. So let's take the line that they do not replace our supplies that came to Europe. And on the other hand, okay, we should not change our line because there is a threat by Iran. I mean, that's not the way it works.
Okay. Thank you very much, and we always try to give our guests something to remember the club by.
Thank you very much.
Apparel. Thank you very much for coming.